Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the third edition of the JUST4ALL Webinars. At this point, we will be discussing engagement and empowerment in contexts of systemic exclusion and its correlation to the just transition and adult learning and education. So with us, we have a really nice panel. We have Jörgen, Laura, and Stin that I will introduce more appropriately in a bit. With that, I should let you know that this is going to be a discussion. We're not going to have a bunch of PowerPoint showing, but we will start with one. And in this one, what we will try to do is just give you a teaser of the grand scheme of things, that is the rest of the MOOC, the Massive Open Online Course, in which these webinars will be included as recordings later on, and in which you will have access also later on to ask any questions that maybe you didn't have time to reflect upon today, and you really want to ask to our panelists or the consortium of our project, the JUST4ALL project, that is bringing us here today. So I will get started with the first and only PowerPoint of today, and I am going to share it right now. Let's see. Presentation mode. I think it should work. Okay. So as we said, we will be talking about engagement and empowerment in contexts of systemic exclusion for the just transition. And this is part of a work package of our project JUST4ALL, Adult Education for the Just Transition, on learning about and acting for the just transition. So just a bit of an introduction to the general JUST4ALL MOOC, because this is our third webinar. Maybe we have new people joining in. Our objective is to provide a comprehensive understanding of the just transition. This means that we are not touching upon only one thing, but we touch upon 8 different modules covering various aspects of the just transition. Each module, I say here, that is approximately 2 weeks long. This is if someone would follow each of the modules from start to finish, seeing the webinar, asking the questions, taking part in the forum, reviewing all the resources, and following our full-scale PowerPoints. That could take you, let's say, 1 or 2 hours for 3 days each week. So that's more or less how we got to the 3 weeks long duration. There is a certification project in our project, but sadly, you need to do a bit more than coming to the webinars, and that bit more is joining us in our learning platform that I will share in just a bit. If you go into our learning platform and you follow all the steps and you follow on our activities, you can get an open badge for each of the modules. And we have a bit of a fun certification, additional certification process, that if you play our games, you will also be able to get a certificate of understanding and of fighting for the just transition. So the JUST4ALL modules, there were 8 of them. We said we've already been through the introduction to lifelong learning and adult learning and education for the just transition. We have talked about social innovation and just transition in the previous webinar. We are talking today about empowering and engaging vulnerable groups. And following in 2024, we will be closing with grassroots initiatives and community learning on the 4th of December in the afternoon, 2 to 3:30 p.m. So it's this is going to be how it will look for 2024. And starting in January, we're going to finish with the last 4 modules, touching upon competencies for the future, awareness raising, actions and campaigns, strategic partnerships, and gamification and other innovative methods to promote the just transition. So in this module that we will be discussing today, as we said, on empowering and engaging vulnerable groups and groups going through systemic exclusion, is that we will try to explore some very critical and key concepts and practices necessary for achieving a fair and inclusive transition for a sustainable future. So what we have done is starting from the key terms, but also then following through with some practical guidelines and real world examples, good practices, and so on, so that we can ensure that as a community, the educational community is ready to really take a stand and take some steps forward to what it means to be empowered in marginalized communities. So to do that, we have, and we will talk more today about some key concepts. Here we have a really short introduction in the module. You can find more, but such a very, very strong introduction about how we perceive these concepts and how we will be discussing these concepts today. We start with engagement. And in the context of a just transition, we refer to engagement as the active involvement of all stakeholders, including marginalized community, in decision-making processes. This means that we do not only request feedback in what we do, but we talk about actively getting involved in decision-making so that we ensure that the voices of everybody are heard and needs are considered in the development and implementation of policies. Moving on to the second concept that is in the title today, empowerment. Empowerment for us involves the communities and providing these communities with tools, resources, and opportunities to influence outcomes and drive change. It is crucial to understand that the empowerment that we perceive is not a top-down process, but a horizontal one. It is a process that has to do with the internal need and drive to change our society. Systemic exclusion is the last key point that we have in the title of today's webinar. And of course, with that, we try to describe the intrinsic barriers and inequalities, the systemic barriers and inequalities that prevent certain groups from participating in social, economic, and political life. And we see that this exclusion in our context is also perpetuated by existing power structures. So you will see that we will be talking about the dynamics that favor dominant groups and withhold a just transitioning to a sustainable economy for groups that have been systemically excluded. But on this, of course, our experts will tell us more about. Another concept that is really actually linked to systemic exclusion that we hear a lot in discourse is marginalization. And with that, we refer to the process by which certain groups are pushed to the edges of society. So with marginalization, what we are interested in here is not the status as much as the process that groups were pushed through in the edges of society in what Spivak calls the subaltern. Let's say, who are those people that we call the marginalized communities, and why is it important that we actually recognize and see that more specifically? So in our context, we see that a just transition has to ensure that there is a shift towards a sustainable and environmentally friendly economy, a well-being economy, as I am sure that Laura is going to talk to us a bit more about, that is fair and inclusive, leaving no one behind. And for that, as we said, we need everybody included, especially those that particularly have been historically marginalized. And we say that because we borrow the very definition of the just transition from the workers' movement in the 70s that were asking to be included in the process of decision-making towards changes in regards to the economic and digital transformations. So it is really important at that effect that we see this as an element that has to do with power, that has to do with hegemony, that has to do with narratives that we listen, that subsequently affect how we engage and how we are empowered as learners and within our communities. Because we get this point across, and we borrow the term just transition from the workers' movement in the 70s, it is always really essential that we also discuss labor and jobs when discussing the just transition. This is an example of what you will find in the module, a bit of an insight on what is happening and some resources next to it so that you can directly follow through some research and some context on what we mean by what we say. So in here, we see more how and what we should do in order to also perceive employment as something that can change, as it is currently unfit for purpose in the context of environmental breakdown and the cost of living crisis, especially for people in marginalized communities. So in that, seeing how labor, seeing how our communities are affected, what is our role as educators and as people working in civil society, it is important that we understand and we highlight and we critically perceive with our learners the necessary decision-making processes, resource allocation, representation, and the most hegemonic narratives that we see in the discussion about the just transition, and see where our community and our communities fit in. So in order to do that, what we have discussed in the module and what we see here at a glance is how can we effectively engage and take part in becoming more empowered in our communities. And all of this has to follow a certain, let's say, pathway that involves inclusive decision making, equitable resource distribution, capacity building for us and for our communities, at all times, transparent communication and critical reflection on our internal power dynamics, the privilege to struggle that we hold, and of course, how to achieve a more effective outreach towards the communities that we are discussing about, because it's nice to talk about it from home, but it's really essential that we work in the field. To support all of that, and I'm closing in this short presentation, we have gathered really nice examples and practices to discuss that, being aware that there are also bad practices out there. And I'm sorry to start with this negative point, but it is actually true. We have seen a lot of practices, especially discussing the engagement and empowerment of systemically excluded groups via lens of tokenism, which what it means with simple words is that we're taking someone and we are promoting them as the diversity, snowflake. We saw them in the beginning of whatever we do, and in deep, we're not actually discussing the reasoning and critically perceiving the power dynamics for people's systemic exclusion. We have resource hoarding, meaning concentrating resources in the hands of dominant groups that then decide how they distribute these tools for the marginalized communities to participate, instead of the communities themselves having the actual say and means of this participation. And of course, we have seen a lot of exclusionary narratives, even in practices that supposedly mean to include marginalized communities, especially in the just transition, and what we're currently seeing, that there is an abundance of knowledge and know-how in dealing with ecosystems held by indigenous groups, held by rural areas, held by previous generations that have been very purposefully misrecognized, for what is perceived as moving forward and innovation. So we put that in because we really want to be mindful of the fact that we need to be aware of our context and the fact that a lot of things are happening in civil society. But we do have also good practices. We have practices that involve inclusive policy making, that promote equitable partnerships, and they also promote transparent governance over their initiatives. But to see all of that in this specific context, we have a full set of successful Just Transition initiatives that you can find in our web page. It's a web page hosted by our coordinators at Solidar. And in this point, it's really important to mention who we are, that we selected all these good practices, who we are, that we got into creating this material for you. And that's where myself and my colleague Tina are coming from the European Association for the Education of Adults in Belgium. Our coordinators, Solidar, also based in Belgium, were both European networks fighting for solidarity and education. We also have the International Council for Adult Education, ICAE, joining us today. I think I saw Maida in the group, and they are the international, as it's in the name, Council for Adult Education. And in that, we are joined by our membership. We are joined by Cardet in Cyprus, EONTAS in Ireland, La Ligue de l'Enseignement in France, and the ABF in Sweden. But about the ABF in Sweden, and more specifically ABF for Örebro County, we have here Jürgen to tell us more about. So these practices that you will find in the link that I believe is shared will be shared in the chat. You will see that this is where we're coming from, and this is why you will also see these countries heavily represented. So other than these examples, the most important thing for us today is that you follow us and you join our learning platform. You can directly scan this QR code, but you can also follow the link in the chat. As you see, we have quite a lot of material for each and every module that we're following through, including a webinar, including resources, discussions, case studies, and introductory material. Yeah, we would be delighted if you also followed us there. I think that with your registration, most of you should already have been added to the list of users. But of course, because we have, I think at this point, 101 registrations, it takes about a week for you to be added in our context. So don't worry if you don't already have access to that. So with that, I'm just going to introduce briefly our speakers. We have Laura Reiners joining us from wonderful Malawi, but she's here in her capacity as a senior advisor for the European Policy Center. We have Jörgen Danielsson, CEO of the ABF Örebro County. We're really happy to have you, Jörgen, here joining us from Sweden, and Stina Stridling, professor in urban sociology at the University of Antwerp and scientific director for the Hannah Arendt Institute, joining us from Belgium, I believe, as well as I am at this point. So that's it for the presentation, and I'm going to quickly jump to the actual interesting discussions. If you want to contact me at any point, you can see my email here, and I'm going to add it as well in the chat in a bit. But yeah, I'll just stop sharing my screen. Everything will be shared with you in 1 week with also additional materials from the presentations of the rest of my colleagues here today. So with that, I think I spoke a bit too much. So I will get the ball rolling with our first speaker, and that is going to be Laura. So hi, Laura. Happy to have you here.
Yeah, it's lovely to be here. And yeah, just to clarify, I am in Malawi, and I'm sitting outside, so occasionally you'll see flies flying past me or landing on my nose. But I have been in Belgium for the last 14 years before I moved to Malawi last year, due to my husband's job. So I have at least, I think, a fair background in European policy making to talk about this topic today. Just to say my background briefly, I work as a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre. It's a think tank in Brussels. During the years I've been working for the EPC, I've been involved in a number of projects around the just transition, also well-being economy, as was previously mentioned. In terms of the just transition, I think the two projects that I've been working on, which are particularly relevant to today's discussion, is one called the Fair Energy Transition for All, or FETA project for short. So from now on, I will probably call it the FETA project just by force of habit. It has nothing to do with cheese. It is all about the energy transition. And the other one was on digital solutions for citizen engagement in the energy transition. So both of them have lessons that I can bring to the discussion today. And I would say, as was mentioned, we have best practice. We also have lessons of things that didn't go so well, which I also think are really, really helpful, because in the end, with all of this, we're learning and everything is constantly developing. What worked yesterday might not work next year. So it's also very much worth looking at what didn't work so well and how we can learn from that. So yeah, just
lovely. lovely.
Just to now get to the questions. Sorry.
I really don't worry about that. And thank you for doing the introduction. That was great. Maybe we can do the same for Jürgen and Stina. Maybe it seems more actual to choose what you will discuss today, and it's really important that that we see this discussion also from a policy aspect, because I think that this is also a field that we do not usually see in terms of including groups that have been systemically excluded. So in that, please let us know what are your findings in terms of how you see the just transition influencing power structures, especially in policy making, and how have you worked in ensuring that citizens' voices are heard and are included, basically through the FETA project? But please go on.
So I mean, I think probably the best news is that, at least at European level, and that's where I have at least the most experience, there is a clear recognition by politicians that we should be including citizens in these discussions. And I mean, that sounds like such an obvious thing to say, but it's a long time not been the case. I think that, we should actually engage with people on these topics. And I think with the just transition in particular, that has really come to the fore more than in any other policy area. I mean, we're talking about such a systemic transformation that it's clear to any politician, frankly, whether you agree with the politics or not, that you need to be taking people along with you. And I don't think you need to be a political scientist expert to see the damage that's being done in different parts of the world by populist politicians who are basically riding on the tidal wave of discontent that's come from people not feeling that they're actually properly engaged in this massive shift, which will affect so many different ways in terms of the way people live. So good point. There is a recognition from Brussels, and indeed with FETA, with the FETA project, we just happen to be coming up with our final recommendations just as Russia invaded Ukraine, and just as then the energy prices went stratospheric in terms of increases. And it still is one of the only projects where we've had the policymakers coming to us to say, we need to know what you're hearing from this project. We need to know what recommendations you have. We will take whatever you have, whether it's not finished yet, whether it's still kind of in process, we will take it. So, like I said, there's definitely a door that's there and it's open. However, there are challenges that I think it's worth pointing out. So although there's a recognition that we want to have citizens' voices heard in policymaking, I think you come up against similar challenges. Firstly, logistical issues. So it's just difficult. it is difficult. It can be time consuming. There are resource constraints. Sometimes you need recommendations right now, and it might take 6 months, a year, 2 years to come up with to engage everybody to get sort of well drafted recommendations, and sometimes that's just not realistic in terms of having to respond to things right now as policymakers. And also, I mean, and again, I hope it's not widely the case, but I think it's fair to say there's still a question as to whether the effort of doing these sorts of citizen engagement projects is actually worth it in the end. Mm-hmm. Will the citizens actually come up with anything that the policymakers haven't thought of themselves? Mm-hmm. And you can argue yes, no, maybe, but I think that's fair to say that there's still an element of that in the debate in Brussels. There is, again, similarly to this, there's a question, I think, with some that are citizens actually genuinely able to come up with long-term policy recommendations that potentially go against their own short-term best interests? We know we need to change the way that we live because of the climate crisis, because of other issues. But does that mean that people are willing to, for instance, put a solar farm in their neighboring field or whatever it might be? There's also indeed a question, and this is what today we're really talking about, is, okay, you try to create a citizen engagement process, but actually how representative is it in the end? Are you actually just talking to the same people who have some influence in the political process anyway, but now you're doing it in a more formalized way, and you're still not reaching other people who should be heard in these discussions? And again, you come across, as with anything like this, you come across a lack of public trust. So then trying to get people to actually engage in this process where they're not convinced that they're, if they're going to actually use the time to help in policy making, what's the point? Because these politicians, they don't listen to us, they don't care about us, they're in it for themselves, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, in terms of how I can see it influencing power structures, that I think the challenge is also that even with the best will in the world, in certain circumstances, digital tools are used for a lot of these processes. And this is, and I'm sure the other speakers will probably talk about this a bit more, this is already exclusionary in some ways. You need to have internet access, a smartphone, or a tablet. You need to have the confidence to use Zoom or whatever it might be if these sorts of processes are going to be done digitally. And oftentimes, even if they're actually done in person, sometimes there's a digital element to it. So that can be challenging too. So yeah, in terms of the influence and power structures, I would say that they're kind of key points to bear in mind. Another point I know you asked me to reflect on is how do you try and ensure that citizens' voices are included? And I mean, again, there's different ways, as I said, that are some working better than others, some work better in some contexts and some in others. You have the sort of more top-down and then the more bottom-up initiatives. So top-down, for instance, something I was engaged in Brussels on the conference on the future of Europe. This is a massive attempt to organize a deliberative exercise looking at the future of Europe. You have citizens' climate assemblies and so on and so forth. So you have things like that, but also you have the citizen-led, bottom-up, if you like, initiatives, which kind of encourage citizen activism in some topics. And I wouldn't say that one is particularly better than the other. I think both of them have had some challenges and some successes, and I think there's a place for both. One lesson maybe to take from the experience of the projects that I was working on, especially the FETA project, is I'll maybe go into more detail on the structure of the project later, but one thing that was quite a unique concept in that project was that we had the citizens coming up with initial policy recommendations, and then the experts taking kind of the views of the citizens and then, if you like, translating them into the current political context in that country. So trying to work with not their own perspective, but what really concretely came from the discussions among the citizens that took part, and then formulate them in a way that basically policymakers might pick up and run with. However, it also went back then. So the experts came up with their policy recommendations, which then went back to the initial citizens to see whether they actually did reflect what was initially being discussed, or whether they missed something, or whether they slightly misinterpreted something. And I think that dialogue between, if you like, the citizen level and the expert level throughout is really, really helpful. And that's not always the case. Sometimes you just have kind of citizens talking, and then it gets translated to the experts, and then you don't have kind of the back and forth. Whereas in this project, it worked really well. I think it was quite unusual, but valuable. And also, one thing in terms of the presentation of the policy recommendations in the end, whether that was in the report or whether that was in the actual policy dialogue that we held, we actually took some of the people who took part in the initial discussions and either recorded them speaking to camera, really giving some of the recommendations kind of in person, if you like, or we took direct quotes from the meetings, of course, with their permission, and put the direct quotes into the paper. And actually, it was a really powerful part of the final publication and the final event. I think, you know, hearing things in quite obvious, sometimes quite blunt, sometimes quite angry language, I think had quite a big impact compared to if you I mean, I hope my documents aren't bland, but sometimes EU level policy documents can be quite bland. But having this really, you know, real life sort of snapshot into somebody's views, I think was really, really powerful. So, you know, as much as possible, actually use the language that people give you. I think it has an impact. Okay, you might need to translate it in some ways or another, literally sometimes translating it from one language to another, but still try and keep the if you like, sort of the raw essence of what people are saying to you.
And then because at the end of the day, that's their voice, and the voice has this exact sound and has this exact sentiment that is not as raffinated as you know, a policy paper, but it's really important that it gets out.
Absolutely, and it really did. You had, even in a couple of lines, you had a real snapshot of a person, and sometimes also we would put the photos of the people next to the quotes, and it was funny. It totally shows how prejudiced I can be, but sometimes the photo totally surprised me in terms of what the text would say. That I had a completely different image in my head of who was speaking, and then I saw the photo. I shouldn't be the case, but we all carry our prejudices with us, and sometimes that was also really impactful. I don't know, one of the final things I was going to talk about, if you want me to go on now, I can, or I can wait for the others, but was about adult learning.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, what do I think the role of ALE is in this process? And again, I'll be really brief because I think the others will talk about this with more depth than I can anyway. But for sure, it became very clear in the recommendations we were having around the FETA project that actually there was a desire from these people. The recommendations were coming from these citizens to have more help, more training available to them, and more accessible, to feel more accessible for them. So for sure, there's definitely a role there. I also found myself reflecting, I mean, my children are not grown up yet, but still I noticed that their education has a lot more critical thinking built into how they're learning. Their curriculum really asks them to think critically about big questions, especially, you know, I'm here in Malawi, so they're also being challenged even at 10 years old to think critically about the political situation here. You start with what seems like a quite simple question, but then start looking at the different dimensions to poverty in Malawi, for instance. And so, yeah, developing this critical thinking, I think is fundamental, and hopefully shows the complexity of some of the challenges that policymakers are dealing with, because in the end, these people are, on the whole, trying very hard to improve the world that they live in. But sometimes the challenges are just extraordinarily complex, and trying to see all the moving parts at one time is very difficult. So at least I hope you end up with a population who's more aware of the complexity of some of the difficulties that we're facing, but also feel more confident to engage in policy discussions, because it should be open to everyone. It often isn't, but it should be. And again, something that I didn't really anticipate from the FETA project, which became clear, is that actually it wasn't the intention to, if you like, provide a forum for citizens to discuss together and with experts. I mean, we were trying to get people's impressions of things, but actually having that platform, having that actual physical space for people to come together, actually, first of all, build a community, which was not at all the point of the project, but actually was definitely a sort of positive outcome where people were more engaged in their community as a result of these discussions. But actually, we also then brought experts when they were requested from the citizens who took part. We brought experts in to then speak to them, to answer their questions. Politicians were actually very interested to come and take part. We weren't having to beg them to come. I mean, they were willing to come. We were organizing this event. They were happy to be there. So actually providing the forum to have these discussions, I think, is really valuable. And ALE can do that. I mean, you have a group of people in a classroom. Well, invite your local policymakers, regional policymakers to come and give a seminar. Most of them will be very happy to come and speak to a room full of their voters. So, I think the door is normally quite well open there. And the final thing is that in the end, when it comes to just transition, we're all guessing to a certain degree. I mean, even the jobs that we're trying to train people for now, how sustainable are they in terms of in the long term? For now, we need a lot of people retrofitting buildings, but at a certain point, the buildings are retrofitted, the heat pumps are installed. And so then what happens to the people that you've then trained up if suddenly we've gone from needing, 100,000 to now needing 10,000 just to kind of maintain things? What happens? So, adult learning is going to have to constantly evolve. And all I would say is, you need that agility continually for a very long time to try and actually keep relevant in terms of what you're teaching people, how you're teaching people to equip everybody for what the just transition actually will bring to us.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Laura. And I think that this really binds very well to the discussions that we had in the previous webinars that are, of course, also available for anyone that wants to look more into them. But there always comes this essential element of how in adult learning and education we have the space we have to have the space provided and open in order to invite these discussions, because we have to recognize that we actually have the means to take this point forward, and we actually are this level of education that has been historically more involved into working with systemic exclusion, even from the theory of it, the very birth of adult learning and education, until the rise of adult learning and education as a critical pedagogy process, and as a pedagogy of the oppressed, followed in adult learning and education. And it always had been in hand in hand with workers' movements, with feminist movements, with migrant movements, and other movements of marginalized communities. So it's really nice to see that from a policy aspect. Also, this is recognized, and let's hope that this platform will open up further. But with that, I have to say that I'm thinking about Jürgen, because Jürgen is, as we said, the CEO of ABF Örebro County, and you will tell us more about what ABF actually is. But you also were a politician. So I think that working for an adult learning and education organization and having this lens of the politician, maybe you can really tell us more about what we already discussed and build on Laura's contribution, but more from your experience working with workers directly, working with grassroots movements. And on that, we want to learn more about how your organization has mobilized the marginalized communities in Sweden, especially on the topic of sustainability and the just transition. And how do you encourage this creation of spaces, as we said, for this communal and inclusive decision making?
Thank you. It's an honor to share the work of ABF Örebro County. where we empower individuals and communities at the grassroots level, while championing socio-ecological justice. Although based in Sweden, our methods and principle resonates across Europe, addressing challenges like integration, labor market inclusion, and sustainability. I plan to present concrete examples and highlight challenges as well as examples of solution. And after that, I intend to address challenges from the society's perspective, where I do not have any practical solution, actually, maybe some thinking. ABF focus on providing marginalized groups with tools to shape their future. Let me highlight 3 key initiatives. Perfect Match initiative. This program supports immigrants in gaining employment and social integration throughout skills assessment, language training, and internship. Despite cultural challenges, nearly half of those participants secured jobs or pursued further education, showing its replicable potential across Europe. We sign for deaf community. We sign integrated deaf community into democratic process, environment advocacy, workshop on climate change and civic rights, support by signing language interpreters, empowered participants to engage in sustainability projects like tree planting and cleanups, staircase resource center, eller trappan på svenska, in Swedish. This initiative empowered foreign-born women distance from labor market throughout tailored education, internship, and health support. Participants gain confidence and skills, with many transition to employment on further education. If we from those 3 examples look into some challenging on the individual levels, culture different often possess barriers but can become opportunities for growth. Key challenges that we have seen is that many struggles with acquiring local language skills, simplified materials, and practical language interrogation into daily activities have shown success. And the proposal to meet that challenges is found comprehensive language programs tailored to vocational and civic needs and training educators in cultural adaptive methods. Another issue that we have and challenge that we have met is it's resistant to new concepts. ideas like unpaid internships or egalitarian workplace can seem unfamiliar for those who attends the project. And tailor workshops and mentorships programs helps bring these gaps. So a proposal there is a develop culture-oriented toolkits and incentives cross-cultural mentorships within workplaces. Another issue is that incorporating sustainable ensure marginalized group contribute to green transition. And what we can see there is that the participant learned sustainable practice like recycling, organic gardening, improving both mental health and environment engagement. In our project Swedish from day one, asylum seekers were introduced to circular economic principle, eco-friendly habits through recycling drives and energy saving workshops, fostering pride and contribution to sustainability. And the conclusion from that project is that empowerment and social ecological justice are interconcept by addressing cultural challenges, fostering inclusivity and promoting sustainability. And we can build resilient communities across Europe. Policymaker and educator play a pivotal role by sustainable funding, also allocate resources for long-term integration and sustainable programs, empowering educators, train facility to use cultural adaptive teaching methods, inclusive policies, involve marginalized communities into creating relevant policies, and together can we create a Europe where every voice matters and every action contributes to just a sustainable future. When we are talking about the society and politician and official, I'm taking for a long time, Angelique. Is it too long?
No. You're fine. You're fine. You can let us know about the actual experience. Of course, it's our pleasure.
Oh, thanks. When it's about when you talk about the society and the lack of understanding among politician officials, in Sweden we can see that many politician officials lack insight on the complex challenges faced by marginalized groups, such as language barrier, cultural difference, and socio-economic obstacle. There's often a lack of long-term funding and strategies to link integration with the sustainable goals of the green transition. This leads to fragmented efforts that do not address participant needs in a holistic way. We in ABF also see a problem with the political debate in Sweden. In Sweden, immigration has often been portrayed as a burden in the political debate, which has a negative effect affected the perception of marginalized group. The focus on immigrant as a problem has created resistance to investing in inclusive program for ABF. This means that work on the mobilizing this group for just transition is made more difficult, as they are stigmatized and not seen as resources in the community building. And the challenging inclusive decision making is lack of platform for participation. The marginalized groups often have limited opportunities to influence decisions that affect their lives and future. When it's about resistance from power, politician reluctance to invest in long-term integration, initiatives reduce resources for inclusive project, and when we are talking about stigmatization, this negative portrayal in the debate makes groups feel excluded and unwelcome in decision-making process, and that's influence even our different projects when we are working with them. And the marginalized group is quite suspicious when they are becoming a part of our project, actually. So that's something we have to start up work with and create an environment where people is feeling that we are listening to them and their problem, and not a part of the big society debate.
Mm-hmm. And this binds really well with what we say about, what we call the bad practice in the module is what you talked about, like having fragmented practices, something really short term happening here, happening there in terms to claim this token. Oh, we discuss that because we have to discuss it. And this binds well with what Laura said, that indifferently of like the politics, everybody knows that in the topic of just transition, people have to be included. But then there is a question of how are they actually included? Is this long-term? Is this something that really appreciates their part in it? And there are many elements in it as well, especially having to do with resources and having to do with trust between the communities, and rightfully so. So I will go to our last introduction, but of course we will have a discussion following. And Steen, I think that this is this is your time to shine, let's say. Let us know a bit more about your research and how you touch on more of this socio-ecological aspect of justice. And I know that you work a lot with urban sociology, so it makes, I think, a lot of sense to discuss also the concept of space that we kind of touched upon. And of course, maybe as a short introduction, you will talk to us about urbanity and diversity and citizenship in this debate and how it is cross-fertilized with science and practice and policy making. So, of course, if you can share anything about how this sense of, let's say, control among communities can be fostered to avoid this exclusion. And what is the role of education in all of that, if you find any?
Okay, thank you, and good morning from my side as well. I think that before we get to the sense of control, what is really important to say is that the discourse of transition is a discourse of change, and it's a discourse of radical change, of disruptive change, of systemic change. So it's a discourse of massive changes coming up to, you know, people that are confronted with. And it's also very much presented by the environmental movement and by environmentally concerned organizations, citizens, as something which is inevitable. It has to happen. There's no way of escaping. Think about the modal shift, for example. We need to shift away from car use. We need to, if it's about energy transition, we need to radically change how we heat our homes, how we use electricity in our homes. So it's really a discourse of radical change, of massive change, which is inevitable. And then I think we need to understand from a sociological point of view how it is that change is interpreted by people, because change is not interpreted in the same way by different social groups. And I think to understand how change is interpreted, very roughly, we need to look at people's resources. So the resources that people have in their command to pursue their life, and also to change if they need to, but also how people experience their life, how they feel their life has been going up until now. You know, what is a general life experience? How are they doing? And I think it's important also to look at that experience, because if you only look at resources, it looks like people don't have any agencies, that don't have any way to make their own choices. And even marginalized groups, who are very often portrayed as victims, as being overcome by certain things that happen in society, also they could make choices. You know, they have some resources and some ways of also responding to society. So they're not just passive victims of whatever happens to them. So it's also important to look at their experiences as well, not to sort of portray them as people with no reason, with no ways of acting for and in themselves. I think what we often do in sociology is make a difference between economic capital and cultural capital. Economic capital is very straightforward. That is really the financial resources and material resources that people have at their disposal. It could be about money, of course. It's a capitalist society after all. It could be about home ownership, ownership of cars or not owning cars. So it's really all the kind of material resources that people have at their disposal. Culture competencies or culture capital is perhaps a little bit more difficult. It is the cultural capacity that people have. And I think Jürgen was already, hinting at that. It's knowing how particular things work. For example, planning on the long term. And if you want to renovate your home, you need to be able to plan on the long term. These capacities are unequally spread across the population. Not everybody has similar experience in doing that. It's about knowing how to apply for a premium from the government. It's about being effective in convincing others or making choices that are based on the best evidence. It's about how to use arguments and emotions strategically. So I think these culture competencies, culture capital is also very important. And very often we see that even more than the inequality in economic resources is the economic and culture resources that is often at play in creating new inequalities and ecological transitions. And what plays in there, and that's, I think, also something that Laura was referring to, this culture capital is very strongly related to people's education level. So there's a really big gap between lowly educated or shortly educated and highly or wrongly educated people in terms of the culture capacities. And that plays into, that's where the populist response plays upon. So change requires resources. change is not evident. I mean, it's much easier to keep on, even for people in marginalized communities, it's easier to keep on doing what you have been doing. Change is always more difficult because it requires resources. So if you have resources, it's much easier to see in a demand to change, to see opportunities, to see something that you might improve. So people generally don't like change. But if change is coming, and if there are opportunities, and if you see the possibility to renovate your home or to change your car into a new electric car, if you have resources, you might see an opportunity there. You might say, well, I have to renovate my home, I have to insulate my roof, or I have to change my car. I don't like that, but I see an opportunity there because my home will be better after that. So if you have resources, you're actually able to see in that change, which is imposed on you to a certain extent, opportunities, benefits. This is not the case if you don't have resources. If you're already at your limits, if you already have difficulties paying your bills, then that change is just a threat. It is not an opportunity. I mean, there's nothing to be gained from that. And the gain is societal. It's for the broader society. It's not for your own. So that's one of the difficulties in terms of economic capital. But then in terms of culture capital, and then we come to your question, Angelica, about the sense of control. If your experience in your life is one of failure, because you didn't do well in school, because you married the wrong guy and you're in debt, or because all kind of things went wrong. And in the sort of marginalized community, there is much more of an experience with failure, with things not going well, with choices that turned out wrong for all kind of reasons, not necessarily personal mistakes, but just because more difficult life circumstances. If your dominant experience with life is one of failure, things not going as planned, things not turning out well, then you don't feel you're in control. If you then say, we need to do this because otherwise society or the environment will collapse, then it's scary because you don't have a feeling of success. If you're highly educated, if you're generally doing well in life, if your education led you to a well-paid job, if your schooling paid off in terms of a better job, promotion, then you have a sense of control. Mm-hmm. And then even if the prospect of the environment collapsing, you might still feel you can do something, that your actual choices and behavior makes a difference, then that really gives you a sense of control. And that's why people like Kennedy and Gibbs, they talk about eco-powerlessness, about people not having a sense of control in general life and also not having a sense of control in the phase of the ecological transition. And they just give, I mean, in one of their papers, they gave an example of somebody, you know, in the supermarket, you have environmentally sustainable products you can buy. Very often they're more expensive and they come with explanation about why that specific product is more environmentally good to buy. And they come with labels. So you need knowledge to understand this. So they give the example in one of their papers, which I think is a very, it's an anecdote, but it's, I think, a good example to explain what I mean. So you have this sort of low income, this member of a low income family, the mother going to shop, and she sees this product with an eco label and she thinks, well, you know, it's better for the environment, but it's also more expensive. So if I buy this, I have something else I cannot buy. So after long deliberation, she says, okay, I'm going to buy this eco label tea, for example, tea bags. And she buys it. And then a few months later, she hears that this eco label is actually not that reliable, that in fact, it's a marketing thing. Then that strengthens the powerlessness that people feel, because they actually have given up something to buy this eco label product. Whereas in highly educated people might feel angry, but next time they make another choice. And it's these kind of things, and the world is full of this kind of eco, greenwashing kind of things that makes people even being even more vulnerable in the phase of the ecological transition, because even if they make positive choices, then they often feel betrayed. I mean, they might say, I insulate my home, and they might hope they get a premiums, and then the government slashes the premiums or halves them. I mean, the sense of powerlessness that gives to especially these people. I mean, everybody will be angry, but it adds to a feeling of powerlessness. And I think it's that sense of control and that lack of sense of control, which is often detrimental to people's support for the environmental transition. Just to finish off, what can we do about it? And I think it's quite a logical response, but it's not that easy to translate into actual policies, is we have to make the solutions collective. Mm-hmm. The only way to make sure that this lack of sense of control does not play against ecological transition is to offer solutions which are collective, which means you need organizations from civil society or governments that take all the risks and the dangers involved in making that ecological transition, and the lack of resources on their shoulders, so that people don't have to worry too much about it. So, for example, I have this example of a heating network. How do you call it? It's a heating network. So a heating network is a collective solution. It's not something you do individual. So you have a neighborhood which is in Antwerp, close to the port, and the government said we want to connect this neighborhood to a heating network, which uses heat from the factories that is not used in the port. It's a collective solution because it doesn't work one house, and you need to connect the whole neighborhood. So it's a risky project. It's a risky project for the government because it only is effective when you add up, when it's scalable, when the whole neighborhood connects to it. But it's also risky from the point of view of the individual citizens in that neighborhood, which is not a very well-off neighborhood, because if they connect to it, and if their electricity or if their heating comes from that collective heating network, they need to be sure that the prices remain affordable. So they need to have trust in the future that if they connect to it, then 5 years later, the prices do not increase and they're stuck in that heating network. So in that sense, the local government Antwerp said, we give an absolute guarantee, a legal guarantee, that the prices will not rise above inflation. We guarantee that. And if the prices rise, the government will pay the bill. And they also have used organizations in civil society to actually individually go to each of the homes to explain what the heating network was on an individual level and listen to people what their concerns about that were. And so I think that's really, really important to strengthen that sense of control is to really offer these collective solutions, and for governments and organizations to absorb the risks and the dangers and the fears that people have when entering a kind of new way of heating your home or traveling and so on. So I think that's really the core message that I want to bring today.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Sten. And this reminds me of the fact that I come initially from Greece, and usually, you see that any good examples that might exist in terms of sustainability measures usually have to do with smaller communities, and that is because there the collective solutions were more easily implemented, only because it was more effective to build this trust towards this change, because it will be frightening. And then in big cities we see that it might also be elitist, because it might show up in the more well-off neighborhoods first, and then trickle down to the areas that are being gentrified, and then to the areas where the marginalized populations and people with lower incomes usually live in. So there was a big distrust in the country for collective solutions because they were seen as an expense that would burden disproportionately the lower incomes. But in smaller cities in the islands, you could see that collective means whole. It meant either the full city or it meant the full island. And there you could see more and more people actually started believing in collective solutions. So it's I completely agree that this is a key element, especially when we're talking about justice, and it involves building community, as you said, civil society organizations going there, acting with it, providing the needed knowledge and the needed education to actually take a step forward in this disruptive change in their lives. So with that, it's I'm coming back a bit to how important this collaboration between these sectors. So you have to have everybody included in order to take these solutions. And maybe this is something for all of you, but how do you see this collaboration being built? How do we reach this element of collaboration, of actual collaboration, that everybody is included and it's not monopolized by the most powerful in that discussion? Because we have seen that in partnerships. So does anybody have any experience in that? Yeah, Laura, go on.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's been touched upon by Jürgen and Sten, actually, and also the same as you've said, that with the FETA project in particular, we were trying, I mean, and I think it's so important at European level as well, we're trying to reach people that are practically invisible, frankly, to European policymakers. They're so marginalized from the discussions that are taking place in Brussels. And so the only way that we found that was actually fruitful in terms of trying to identify these people, trying to engage these people, was using a network of trusted allies, local trusted allies. So not even representative organizations at Brussels, or even at the member state level, really talking to organizations who are working on the ground with the communities, the people that we're trying to reach. Frankly, also because as you've all alluded to, actually, we're dealing with people who not only are disengaged, but are completely distrustful of the whole policymaking process as well. So trying to start from scratch in terms of building trust and relationships with people, first of all, identifying them and then building the relationship. I mean, we're talking about a process that could take years, whereas actually using church groups or synagogues, or even social workers, the people who are really on the ground, to identify people who potentially might be interested to take part. It was a really, really important aspect of the project. It was also difficult because in the end, again, at Brussels, we're sitting in Belgium and we're trying to reach, I don't know, migrants in Spain, or there were, sort of rural poor people in Bulgaria, for instance. I don't have friends who I can reach out to in that in those different communities. But if you give yourself enough time, you will find the people that you need to speak to find the people that you need to speak to. It just does take time and it does take effort. And I'm not saying it's always practical, but there are definitely ways. And certainly using those avenues was for us the most fruitful way of engaging with this particular, if you like, group of marginalized people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what you say has a lot to do with what I think Steen said about agency. We have to recognize that there is agency, and there is not a passive perception of change by the community. So it's really important to build on that when we discuss about like trusting a concept and trusting a project. And we have this notion in projects that we have initiatives more than projects that we have worked with. Regarding like having ambassadors from the community, people from the community that in one way or another have found out what an organization does, what an initiative does, and then spread that through the community, because that's there's the language, there's the point of reference, and there's the actual experience, the lived in experience of participating in something coming from a specific background. I don't know if Jørgen or Steen, you have anything to add on this, Steen?
Maybe in terms of policy making, I mean, coming from if you take the perspective from social policies that address inequalities, that address social vulnerabilities, there's a very strong tendency in that field to have policies on a large territorial scale, because the idea is to redistribute resources from rich to the poor. So you need to organize that on a wide scale, and I mean a national scale, but even cohesion policies or on a European scale. But I think the problem with policies on that level is that they become very sectoral. It's education policy is different from environmental policies, and then it becomes very difficult to integrate. And so I think what we need to do is to sort of revalue place-based policies, which very often is looked at very skeptical by people people that are focusing on inequalities and vulnerabilities, because it looks like you focus very much on the poor communities and you move away from redistribution. But the added value of place-based policies is you take one particular neighborhood, you can make it very concrete what the challenges are there, and you make the connections also very apparent. So for example, that heating network in that particular neighborhood, it is very clear, if you want to do this, that you want to draw the port authority into what's happening in the heating network in the neighborhood. So you have to draw together a port authority, which probably would never be concerned really about energy provision in that particular neighborhood. You can also look who's living in that neighborhood. Maybe a lot of people in that neighborhood work in the port, so you may draw in the trade unions. as a way of getting to this community. You may look whether there's neighborhood associations. Maybe there is a church community there that has some outreach to the community. So by focusing on very particular places, you can also bring together the actors, regardless of the particular policy sector they're tied to, but that are active on the ground, and create every time new actor configurations which cut across sectors to do that. And so I think we need to reevaluate this very place-based perspective, because that's the level which is closest to people's everyday life, and where you can see which kind of coalitions you need, which kind of sectoral policy fields you need to make a change in that neighborhood. And you also make the change visible. If people see appearing people doing the actual building works to make the heating network work, it becomes very close, and you can organize education on the spot where these things happen and explain what is going on. I
completely agree. It's the actual is living through it, is becoming a member of it, of the process of it, by actually experiencing it, rather than just hearing about it and being in a sequence of designing and strategizing and that's, I think, a problem that everybody that works on policy and advocacy as we do at EAA, sometimes you feel a bit powerless because what was it? I think it was 3-4 years ago, UNESCO came up with an educational report on what happens and what is the future of education. It was a report on the future of education, and then you would hear everything that we were saying as civil society and Society for Education, but then you couldn't help but notice that, if we are saying that to the policymakers, and then the policymakers say that, who are they saying that to, and what is a role then if we all share the same sentiment, but then change is withheld? So it's and thank you, Tina, for adding the futures of education, the vision paper from UNESCO in, because I remember that we had a working group at the EAA, and the discussion kept on being that we're happy that our views are included, but then this adds in this feeling of powerlessness if you see that so many ministers and so many politicians always also talk about this, but we do not see the effect of the change. So leaving it and having this place-based policies actually implemented and actually lead through is very essential. But in this, I don't see a question in the chat, but what brings me back, especially because we talked about the role of the trade unions, the role of civil society, and I know that ABF, maybe more than all of our organizations, is exactly in the middle, because you work with trade unions heavily, Jürgen, and you work a lot with workers. How does that affect also the process of the learning provision, and how you decide the curricula as an organization that works with this within these synergies, that works with the labor market, that works with education, that works with sustainability? Is there a process that maybe you could share with us on the topic?
Yes, absolutely. We start with those who is participating in our, for an example, project, or in the normal education and things we are doing all the day, and we try to build alliance with different powerful groups actually, and are taking their knowledge and using them in the education actually. So when we are working with the labor movement, for an example, we are using those teachers from that organization, so to collaborate with those who are participant in this project, and you create a network between those who participate and those who are from the labor union, for an example. We also work with different companies and NGOs in our society, and try to create a connection between those and the marginalized groups that are attending, for an example, a project, and where they can go and work for a couple of hours to learn both the culture on the labor market and also meet the different both needs and that different companies and NGOs have to hire new employees, and also to learn the culture on the labor market that they don't usually have as a marginalized group, because they haven't been on the labor market actually. I also want to answer the question before you have a discussion about, and that's quite the same answer actually. When you're working with a marginalized group, you also need to think about how you create an alliance with different powerful groups in society. You can't just work inside the project and just focus on that. You need to even be external in that project. And usually you forgot that part of a quite important thing actually. I went to Ancona, Italy, a while back and checked on how cooperatives were helping out migrants. They didn't just teach them Italian; they were really into getting them involved in the community. They had all sorts of cool activities where locals and migrants could hang out, for an example. So even to influence politicians, you maybe don't have to go to them directly. It may be better to create an alliance with different groups in the society, and after that influence politicians, because they are usually want to win election, and that's the most important thing. Then they don't want to have a problem with the voters, and they don't want to have issues who is influencing their possibility to win an election. So I think you need to you can't, if you want to influence politicians, I think you need to work in that direction to influence society in a bigger concept actually.
Yeah, this also has to do with not perpetuating segregation by only working with one group at a time. And, you know, this is for this group and this is for that group, and they're completely separate. But this way you also grow the movement. Of course, you will not have everybody in, because it will not be profitable for several parts and groups of society, but these are not the groups that you try to reach. But opening it up to, you know, if you're working with the lower classes, with the proletariat, let's say, it doesn't mean that you don't work with the middle class, and you keep on separating, because change affects everybody. And if we want again to move towards more collective solutions, we will have to work, you know, transdisciplinary, like change and make stronger alliances. I know that we don't have too much time. We have actually less than 10 minutes. We have 7 minutes. If anyone from our participants would like to pose any questions anonymously or eponymously, please let us know. You can raise your hand or write it in the chat. I don't see someone asking anything, because like at this point we should close a bit and give you an option for the logistics but of the next webinar and what we're doing. But I have to say that this has been an exceptional discussion, and thank you so much to our panel. I think that this is going to be a recording that we indeed will want to keep for a long time, and hopefully more people will see. So thank you so much for this. I'm still going to wait for people's questions. But yes, thank you so much. This is just the third discussion out of 8. We still have a good amount to go, with the next one being on the 4th of December, 2 to 3:30 Central European time. All of you that are with us today, you will receive an email with the recording, the additional material that we will receive from our panelists, as well as the details to join the next webinar. And thank you, Tina, for putting in the details for our next webinar. We really hope to see you there. And I don't know, any last words, any last remarks from our panel? Any famous last words before we close?
That feels like a lot of pressure.
Is it? I'm putting you on the spot. This is a new level of marginalization, pushing to the edges of this webinar. But yeah, I don't know what more could be said. I think the discussion was already really full.
Maybe I just finish with what I kind of started with, is that good practice or bad practice, it's still worth trying. And some things, even with the best will in the world, will go wrong, but that's extremely helpful learning for the next time. And marginalized people generally are a particularly difficult kind of like segment of society to reach, but actually there's the same challenges that you're trying to, one of my colleagues was talking to investors in Frankfurt last week and having challenges with, their distrust of politicians and lack of, positivity for the political agenda. And like, well, okay, you can be an investor in Frankfurt, or you can be, someone in a small house or a small apartment in a big city somewhere struggling to make your ends meet. But the learnings can work for everybody. So yeah, there's a lot of best practice out there, but there's also lessons that you can take to shape your own work, whether that's in adult education or in other sectors as well. Definitely.
It's always it's a trial and error a bit, but the more the trials, the less the errors. That's how it goes, and even every error is a lesson forward. So I completely salute that, and I see in the chat that people need a bit of time to review and reflect on that. If you want to do that, please join our platform. As we have already said, you will have plenty of time, and you will see that next week the form for this webinar will pop up. So what we will do is get the recording edited to provide you a bit of more information, and that will be available soon. Where under the actual video, you are able to make comments and ask questions, and our panelists will be taking a look from here and then and seeing if they can answer to you. And of course, we will be doing that internally at EAA and in Solidar and the rest of the partnership I know of. So thank you so much. If I don't know, I don't want to cut anyone off. But yeah, if we don't have any last words, I think that this is it. So thank you so much, everybody, and please join us in the next webinar. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.